We are 6 years on from Breath of the Wild and live in a post-Elden Ring world. And with Tears of the Kingdom around the corner, I thought it best to look at what Breath of the Wild did well, and not so well, as we have time to assess it now that it has come into focus with what Elden Ring has refined further in the open world genre. So on the heels of this, I replayed Breath of the Wild and then took the absolute crazy step of breaking down the gameplay second by second from the first time you press a button until last. I also did this for Elden Ring and Horizon Zero Dawn. You may be asking why I devoted days of my time scrubbing through long play footage of these games to make Excel graphs, and I chose a long play where the game was completed, the 4 divine beasts were conquered, and the Master Sword was collected before defeating Ganon, as I believe those are the main aspects of the game most people would do. Similarly for the other 2 games, the major objectives were completed. Not all shrines and Korok seeds were collected, and it was not a speedrun. Personally, I would have watched 3 separate players do long plays and then averaged the data, but I mean, I have other stuff I want to do, mate. Obviously, the time to complete this game can widely vary, but I believe it followed a decent average playthrough. There were deaths, there were mistakes, and backtracking, but some of the puzzles were solved quite quickly, which implied to me that this wasn't exactly the first time playing. Similarly with Elden Ring and Horizon with the strategies used. I broke the gameplay down into different types. Text conversations, any part of the game where you have to progress through text or menus, and you must keep pressing A to go forward. Some text appears in cutscenes, but you cannot progress it through the controller, so this is not counted. Cutscenes. FMV or in-engine cinematics where you cannot continue them by pressing A. You can skip the cutscenes, and most of these cutscenes in Breath of the Wild, including the shrine opening cutscenes, weren't skipped in this long play, which obviously could vary. Also, if a cinematic is part of a text conversation, i.e. 5 seconds pass where the camera pans around an area, I would say that's a cutscene, and only that camera pan will be recorded as a cutscene. Loading screens. Simple enough, but it must have the spinning loading icon bar or some way to indicate it is actually loading and not some cinematic to cover up. Finally, player-controlled gameplay. The player themselves can do anything they would like. I, however, did break this down a little bit further into specific parts of the game. Travelling, combat, and climbing. Travelling includes moving across the overworld, solving puzzles, gliding, or anything that doesn't constitute fighting or climbing. I break these down into even smaller parts such as shrines, dungeons, villages, and mini-games. Combat is from when you enter a fight with a mob of monsters and you strike the first enemy to when you finish the last enemy in that mob. Climbing is whenever Link enters the climbing state. Sometimes you can walk up steep inclines, but I specifically looked for when Link entered and exited the climbing animations. As a note, I included the UI and menus in the travelling section. So let's get to it. What did my scrubbing through 33 hours, 37 minutes and 59 seconds of Breath of the Wild gameplay glean for me? Well, first of all, 72.8% of the game is pure player-controlled gameplay. I then compared this with the following graphs from Elden Ring and Horizon, where we see 94% of the game is player-controlled for Elden Ring, with only 38% for Horizon Zero Dawn. Of this 72% of the game, 74.7% is spent travelling in some way, so a whopping 54.3% of the entire runtime, or 18 hours, 24 minutes and 14 seconds of Breath of the Wild are spent travelling, moving from place to place. Which I would have been shocked at had I not replayed the game. 17% of the game is spent in combat, and 8.3%, accounting for 2 hours, 2 minutes and 43 seconds of the game, is spent climbing. Now, I adore Breath of the Wild. It's one of the all-time greats, but this is certainly a problem now that the open world genre has evolved. The fact that travelling and climbing takes up such a massive portion of this game means that you're spending a lot of time doing nothing very difficult. Riding a horse, walking or climbing a wall. Where this works is that the music, the environment and the sense of discovery is magic in the game. But when I spend 2 hours climbing and the only thing I remember about it is that I sometimes picked up a rushroom and I was immensely happier when I picked up Rivali's Gale, that's a problem area. Gliding through the air, riding a horse and walking around certainly is at your discretion, as it gets you towards the interesting parts of the game, but it also just draws me back to Elden Ring. This follows the same sort of formula in the open world genre, but it doesn't let you climb anywhere. You can summon Torrent at any time and the movement is very quick and the map is extremely densely packed, even more so than Breath of the Wild. But the speed of which you can travel is quick enough that it reduces the time between these points of interest, whilst keeping that alluring mystique of this interesting world. If we look at the time spent travelling in Elden Ring and even Horizon, travelling is the largest portion of the player control in these games as well, but it's less than half the player's attention. Elden Ring clearly focuses on combat and Horizon focuses on scripted set pieces. This may come from the difference in gameplay style and how open-ended Breath of the Wild is, but it still wouldn't be such a bad idea to have some more tailored areas to focus on the strengths of the Zelda series. More puzzles, fun combat, and yes, dedicated dungeon areas. If we actually break the travel down a bit further with Zelda, we see that 83.7%, a whopping 18 hours, 23 minutes and 16 seconds of the game, is purely travelling on the overworld, and 12.4% of it is moving through the villages. Whereas similarly, 75% of Elden Ring's game time is spent travelling through the overworld as well, yet the Soulsborne staple lends more towards this area of gameplay, as it usually tells a massive story through the world as opposed to overtly through cutscenes, which is why we see Horizon spending 49% of its time travelling on the overworld, as it's actually focused upon telling the story to the player and its scripted set pieces. It trims a lot of the A to B traversal off for this. Personally, I believe it would improve Breath of the Wild to increase the complexity and the amount of combat or dungeon exploration it has in the game, so I think those are the key strengths of Zelda gameplay, or to really focus on the beautiful world design and intricate world building, if Nintendo desires to distance themselves from classic Zeldas. Also with the data, I found a couple of quirks. There are 335 messages that pop up when you pick up a new item or open a chest, which totals to 11 minutes and 10 seconds of gameplay, each one coming to about 2 seconds on average. There were 72 separate cooking instances, which came to 6 minutes of gameplay, which were 5 seconds of gameplay on average each. And in the long play, we encountered 22 Koroks out of 900 for a total of 2 minutes and 34 seconds, each Korok on average 7 seconds of gameplay. So, could potentially have been a whopping 1 hour and 45 minutes of gameplay spent in the Korok menus, or text boxes. Finally, Link falls into a pit or fails something which leads to you respawning, and that takes a total of 1 minute and 16 seconds of gameplay with a small 2-second wait. But the bigger deaths were not recorded separately, but they take an average of 1 minute and 3 seconds every time to finish the animation, game over screen, and load you back to where you were. And this all totals up to about 21 minutes of game spent looking at the same screens, which, while nice the first few times, does get tiresome halfway in. Once again, if we compare this to Elden Ring, it does not pause the gameplay at all, with any item crafting, new item collection or anything. It just keeps the player playing. The only similarity is the deaths, where control is wrested from the player to give you a game over screen, or a you died screen. On average, it took 18 seconds from being killed to being straight back in the game. Even when you speak to NPCs in the game, you can freely move around and choose to avoid it instead of being locked into the actual text conversation. I would love Tears of the Kingdom to take some liberties going forward and only have the chest animations play for the big juicy items, or the cooking and Korok animations toggleable in the menus, as it would let you just get back to the juicy gameplay just quicker. I looked at from when you press the first button, to when you first control the main character, to when you're actually allowed freedom in the game. And this is specifically you're free to do as you please without scripted segments or specific tutorials. This is a little bit contentious for some people, as I counted Breath of the Wild as fully able to play when you leave the Shrine of Resurrection. Since you have access to all the gameplay mechanics, you just don't have the map or the runes unlocked. This may be debatable, as you don't leave the plateau for about 3 hours, but I would still say you have a vertical slice of the full game as soon as you leave the Shrine of Resurrection. Also, I count character creation as 5 seconds and not the first gameplay. So, as you can see from these graphs, Breath of the Wild is very quick in letting the player play. It takes just 1 minute and 14 seconds for you to actually control the game from pressing start, which is fantastic. It lets you straight into the game. I think that plays very well to its strengths in that the game is all about discovery. And giving you cutscenes or background information on the world isn't really beneficial. You can discover it yourself. Now, what it shows here for Elden Ring and Breath of the Wild being that it allows you full control and exploration very quick into the game. Breath of the Wild gives you access to the full game within 5 minutes and 10 seconds. Elden Ring lets you explore Limgrave within 9 minutes and 34 seconds. And the strengths there with these two games, which I would consider now the pinnacle of the open world genre, is that you're just allowed to explore. It has supreme confidence in its own world and its game. And to quote Yahtzee Croshaw,
"Here is my world," the ideal sandbox says. "I don't care where you go in it, because wherever you go, you will find something good. That requires supreme confidence."
We see with cinematics, world building and scripted segments are how the other games begin specifically, and which take nearly double the amount of time. And that's where you see Horizon Zero Dawn taking 36 minutes, 27 seconds to let you off the leash and allow you to experience the game at your own pace. Here's some other fun tidbits before I go on to the next topic. There are 20 separate tutorial screens in Breath of the Wild. There were 298 separate loading screens, 369 separate cutscene incidences, 401 text conversations, 185 separate climbing incidences, 213 separate non-boss combat encounters. On average, each memory was a cutscene worth 2 minutes and 18 seconds. And in total, the cutscenes for the memories took 28 minutes 49 seconds. And a fun fact for Elden Ring is that there were 46 minutes and 45 seconds of cutscenes in the game, which only amounted to 2% of the entire game. All of these either being the opening introduction cutscene or the boss introduction cutscenes.
The loathsome dung eater.
Now here's an area of the game I believe could be improved quite immensely, and that is combat. Across the 30 odd hours of playtime and the 213 combat encounters, there were moblins, bokoblins, Lizalfos, skeletal versions of each, choo-choos, keese, octoroks, wizrobes, mini-guardians, mini-talos, and some Yiga clan. So, if we're being generous, we have 14 separate non-boss enemies. Logically, with those numbers, you'll need to repeat some similar style fights with decent variations in traps to where they're located. And let's compare this once again to Elden Ring, with its Soulsborne focus on encounters and combat. I'm being generous here to Breath of the Wild and only taking enemies with good variance in mechanics and attacks. We have 82 separate enemies and 24 major bosses, which goes up to 75 if you count every unique health bar boss. This just makes the world feel much deeper and well lived, with so many unique discoveries to be made because there are so many different types of enemies and bosses. You never know what's going to be behind that gold fog gate. This combined with the fact that Link picked up 428 weapons during my time watching. So, with the degradation of weapons, we picked up a different weapon and used it every 4 minutes and 39 seconds, or nearly 2 weapon breaks per combat. But this is much higher for the bosses. There isn't much variance in the actual combat, which may have came about by the speed at which the weapons break. And this is something that I believe could be alleviated in future games if we reduced the weapon breaking quite a lot or removed it, and it would lead to less time in the game cycling through menus, more in the combat. No, Breath of the Wild doesn't have that finely tuned Soulsborne combat, but it does need a bit more to it. Things like different movesets and skills that Link could learn, which allow you to approach combat in different ways, or enemies with much more varied weak points, would be certainly closer to that Zelda experience than the Soulsborne. Now, let's go on to the dungeons. The Divine Beasts take on average 22 minutes, 12 seconds to complete. The Yiga Hideout took 8 minutes and 49 seconds to get to the boss, and Hyrule Castle weirdly took 13 minutes and 41 seconds to get to Ganon. I produced a few graphs to show how much time is spent in each, with clearly Varnaboris being the most time-consuming. I then compared this to the legacy dungeons of Elden Ring to show the length, which clearly shows the vast difference in scale, length and intricacy between the two. While the Divine Beasts aren't traditional Zelda dungeons, they are small, clever puzzles in an open world setting, and it tries to merge traditional Zelda gameplay with its new focus on its open air gameplay. But these were completed far too quickly and didn't leave much of an impression. Elden Ring, once again, is lauded for its traditional Soulsborne linear areas, merging its open world gameplay change with its core roots. And Zelda could learn from this by incorporating more puzzles or interesting creatures and bosses with thematic weaknesses, and perhaps even remixing with non-linear design instead of focusing on an item recontextualizing the dungeon. For instance, Hyrule Castle is commonly lauded as the best dungeon in this area, as it's a big area you can approach from any angle with lots of rooms and different things to attack. Some restrictions in linear structure would benefit the game, and maybe improve these areas. But what shocked me was actually how little time is spent on Hyrule Castle compared to how much people love that dungeon. Perhaps as it's just a big area with lots of small rooms, secret areas, and entrances that can be tackled in any different way, which merges well with the open air gameplay. Maybe that's the way forward? If they go down that route, Elden Ring is certainly the game to follow. As things like Leyndell, which is just essentially a massive sprawling capital with loads of different encounters, areas, interlocking map design. It was an amazing thing to explore for both world building and setting, and generally getting that fix of that Soulsborne combat. If you have bigger sprawling areas in Breath of the Wild to explore, it certainly feels like a big toy box to play with all the mechanics. It just felt like the Divine Beast would contain puzzle boxes. So either go the route of making traditional Zelda dungeons and restricting the gameplay, or do a lot of Hyrule Castle big sprawling worlds which you can explore from loads of different angles. Now let's get on to the bosses. Looking at the times to complete the bosses, Thunderblight Ganon stands out as it's almost double the length of each of the other Divine Beast bosses. That may be due to balancing, or just how it's tackled, how it has a more of a combat focus and requires you to actually master dodging. But looking at Koga, the reason that takes so long is it has 3 phases, and each of those is behind a big wind-up. You have to wait for it to do its move to then attack it. And Ganon is Ganon. It has 2 big forms and it's the final boss. So that's about what I expect. I really dislike the Divine Beast bosses as they just look so similar and don't stick out very much. Thematically, they make sense, but considering Koga is the most interesting boss that I can remember from the game, it's definitely an area that needs to be improved. Interestingly, in the lead up to the dungeons, you have to fight the Divine Beasts in some way, with their descendants. Varuta, Varnaboris and Varmedo all have segments on average which take 2 minutes and 56 seconds which lead up to the dungeon entrance. However, Varudanis is 17 minutes and 31 seconds. It just shows the difference in gameplay mechanics there, with the first 3 being fairly similar in style of shoot an area on the boss. Of the Elden Ring bosses, obviously the biggest draw is to fight them over and over again, and they're crushingly hard and can kill you immediately, so you'll often die and come back to them. It benefits from this style of gameplay where each boss is wildly different and a magical big beast with unique gameplay, which is why they have so much variance. With Elden Ring, the biggest time sink I could see for this clearly experienced Soulsborne player was the Fire Giant, and that took him 8 minutes 55 seconds to complete. So on average, a boss in Elden Ring actually takes 1 minute 15 seconds to defeat. This is obviously if you're a skilled Soulsborne player. Which is interesting, as the Breath of the Wild averages for all of the bosses together is about 4 minutes 30 seconds. Looking at the Blood Moons, you can see that they get quicker and quicker as you play the game, which nicely increases the difficulty curve along with how the player improves. It's a nice little system that keeps the world fresh, and I love that system compared to somewhere like Elden Ring, where Elden Ring has what I would call a Dragon Quest style difficulty curve, where you can go to certain areas early if you want, but you'll get your head smashed. This allows the entire map to be explored right from the get-go, which you can't do in Elden Ring. You can explore everywhere in Breath of the Wild immediately if you want to, and the enemies will be just tough enough to fight, and I think that's wonderful. I think that really encourages proper exploration there. And finally, let's move on to the shrines. In the run I observed, there were 62 shrines, along with the 4 rune shrines, totaling 66 out of the 120 possible. On average, they took 3 minutes and 32 seconds to complete, but these are helped along by the shrines that are completed for doing an overworld task, i.e. Eventide Island. There are 11 shrines I observed that serve this function, where they are a reward for doing the overworld obstacle, and they just give you a chest and an orb. So if we remove those, the average actual shrine challenge took 4 minutes and 7 seconds to complete. The first 4 shrines, where you actually receive your runes, if you actually remove the cutscene of you getting those runes, they took an average of 2 minutes and 40 seconds of gameplay each. Only 8 of these shrines contain a piece of a clothing set, which is as close to any permanent reward you can receive in this game. Yes, the Spirit Orb lets you level up Link, but I think it would be nicer to get something that isn't an opal or an ancient core for your troubles in solving the extra puzzles. I just wish there were more clothing options and more that could be upgraded. I really love the EX stuff you get from the DLC, where you get to wear the Majora's Mask and stuff. But they would really be cool if they were actually the genuine rewards for tough puzzles. I would love it if I got Tingle's hood from doing a puzzle. 11 of these shrines had some combat in some shape or form, whether it be a combat challenge or stray guardians inside, which totaled to 21 minutes and 37 seconds of gameplay. 5 of these, however, had the dreaded motion controls inside them, for 9 minutes and 22 seconds of gameplay. Taking the averages, there was only a 5-second difference, with more combat per shrine. Eventide, which is my personal favourite part of Breath of the Wild, took 30 minutes and 34 seconds to complete, which is triple the size of the longest shrine puzzle, 10 minutes and 48 seconds. Now, there doesn't seem to be much consistency in the challenge or time spent in each of these shrines, as you can see in the graph from the massive range of differences. While they are varied enough in terms of puzzles, it is completely random how long each challenge would take to complete. Longer form mini dungeons with a more substantial reward would be better for the player in my opinion. It is easy to look back on Breath of the Wild with the data and the foresight from games that have literally taken inspiration from it and built upon it. Mario 64, Dark Souls, Doom. You can feel their influence on modern game design today. And you can see this with Breath of the Wild in the open world genre. Its sense of exploration and freedom is nearly unmatched. The creative mechanics and the systems that work so well together, and this sense of magnitude to the world considering what came before it. I'm sure that with Nintendo's track record, they will only improve upon this formula with Tears of the Kingdom.